today is really about celebration of Cornelia, Julie, all of the amazing women practitioners here in these rows, and it's hard to... So it's really hard to talk, and I actually took a more sort of personal response, kind of response to the charge here from TCLF, and so some of my remarks are really just colored by like my own struggle. So I'm imagining that many of you are going through this as well. So I kind of wanted to talk about what is landscape architecture in the landscape emergency, because as is probably well known by everybody in this room, we have an extinction crisis. We are losing 1 million animal and plant species. We have 22 listed species gone in the United States just last week. We have wetlands disappearing 3 times faster than forests, whatever that means for this horrifying, non-statistic. We have a Living Planet report. I was born in 1971 with 2/3 a decline in wildlife populations during my lifetime. We have birds. If you know me, I'm a wild bird buff, vanishing from North America at a wild rate. 3 billion over the past half century. So we are designing amidst ecocide, plain and simple. I'm not sure we are the ones qualified right now to really address the climate crisis. We can do what we've been trained to do, but we have not been able to really grapple with ecocide at the scale of what's happening. And I would just say one thing is incredibly clear, that best practices mean almost nothing. Much of the information that we have to actually begin to avert the climate crisis has been available to us for decades. Let's say, Jimmy Carter's solar panels on the roof, oft cited, but this is a case of just several weeks ago, 226 dead migratory birds, warblers, birds, towhees, I see in the image, on one day, September 20th. This was collected by Melissa Beyer with Project Safe Flight, where I volunteered back in 2003. So the architecture, the parks that we are making have been, essentially contributing, unfortunately, to this process. So you don't put a wetland next to a glassy developer building. You need to understand the interrelationships between these things. So this is a little bit of a blast from the past, and I met Hillary Brown's cousin somewhere on the way in. There he is. So I worked with Hillary Brown way back in the day in 2008 to do bird-safe building design guidelines that were adapted by the American Bird Conservancy. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter that solutions are in front of us. They are at our fingertips. We don't do them. I'm concerned. Information does not equal change. So my question, and I'm sure the question on everyone's lips, is what are we doing? How are we doing it? Where are we working? Who is participating? And what should we be doing? It's really hard to know, frankly, because while we're designing and specifying landscape architecture projects, the larger physical landscapes that sustain us are dying. Have we been able to engage at the scale of the challenge? I don't know. This is my struggle, and I'm sure everyone's struggle, because I do feel like the unit of the project is insufficient. So landscape architecture, unfortunately, does not equal change. And all of us, I know, are struggling within our work and our practices to do more. So I'm excited to be here with Courageous by Design. And I think there's a struggle to represent what climate change means in landscape architecture. This is the incredible park done by Heather Wick and MNLA and a team. And, but there is a critique against the project or the projects, which I know from experience tried to do incredibly innovative things and were stopped by policy for not putting things in the water, et cetera. So the project itself and the projects that we are doing did not necessarily equal climate change. So that's my only point here. So we do need to move further. We need to get to the roots of the problem and the challenge, which is CO2. And carbon emissions, right, and fossil fuels. So this sort of harkens back to an early study that I did in 2010 called Petrochemical America. This is a photograph from a trip to Louisiana, and photographing these fence-lined communities. Cancer Alley was one of the places, like Love Canal in New York, that was the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. So this book with Richard Misrach, the incredible photographer, basically traces the history of environmental justice, builds on a narrative from Richard's photographs, looks at this 100 linear mile corridor known as Cancer Alley, or the chemical corridor, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and unpacks it spatially over time, and then began to sequence Richard's photographs, build up a narrative, and try to draw a more complete, or like holistic at least, attempt to draw a story about the American landscape and our addiction and our consumption of fossil fuels, because we're all designing within this already incredibly impacted construct, right, within this impacted world. So landscape architects, I do feel like, because of our training, are special and extremely qualified to understand and visualize the relationships between things. So, and this is where I think we could do better. The book traces extraction, consumption, waste, and displacement. And one of my big fears right now is landscape is somehow part of the consumption economy, and our clients, as much as we, and I'm personally conflicted about all of this, are in effect kind of, a part of this consumption economy. So that as we're constantly consuming, and as we're burning fossil fuels, these, for example, the bald cypress forest you see here on the left, are turning into ghostly poles. So we can make projects, but we can't close our eyes to actually what's happening in the world at large. So what are some of the things that we can do? We can listen, we can make, and we can unmake. And I've been focusing a little bit more lately on trying to do more listening and more unmaking. I've also been trying to grapple with a charge at me that's not design. And so I do feel like a big part of what we need to do together is to sort of reflect on what is design and what is not design, what goes in the box in the picture, what goes into the preserved landscape versus the unpreserved landscape. Because I don't think it is actually clear what goes in the box right now. I think we're all finding our way toward that moment. Because if it's not designing, what is it? But anyway, we need to bring our tools to bear. We're trained to organize our workflows into these categories of professional services. We do it at Scape, and all professional service firms do that. And we prepare them for bid and construction by others, when probably what we also need to be doing is just proliferating awareness, loving the landscape, care and stewardship, and bringing climate mitigation and justice to the forefront of everything we do. So I wish I could do this and just cross out the stages. We've all done, our the dreaded fee proposal. I'm like, I don't know, 20,000? So, and that would be just so wonderful. But we need to think about phases that reflect the social life of landscape, and how can we rewrite and place what we need to be doing into frameworks of movement building and what I've been calling loosely collective gardening. Here's the new phases: love the landscape, visualize the invisible, foster ecosystems as infrastructure, nurture and create participatory processes. And so this is this notion of what does it mean to design for the next century? How can it be more deeply rooted in social life, in conversations, interaction, and interdependence? So these are some verbs. This is like Smithson's verb list: depave, explode, jackhammer, rip out, protest, retrofit, subtract, connect, ban. Nothing really that's going to go on the ASLA cover, but nevertheless, it'll feel really good, and we'll all do it together. And I think that the challenge here, and again, this is totally an auto-critique, and I think among friends, right? Because it's like, what are we really doing? So I do feel like this additive and beautifying impulse in landscape is insufficient relative to the world that we have made, that fossil fuel context. So we're losing the sound of bird calls, incredible aesthetic, if you will, which is of a plumage that's very different from sort of the sublime or the beautiful or the picturesque. It's almost like the macro environment in which we perceive all texture, color, etc. We're losing the mystery of contiguous dense forest, shoals, and shallows. So we have to consume less, drive less, and extract less, and we can't spend or design our way out of ecocide. So now I'm just going to fly through a couple of slides. That's really my remarks for the day, and just give some quick examples of what this means. Retrofitting New York City for sea level rise back after Superstorm Sandy, testing environmental ecological infrastructure in 2008 with a team from Stevens Institute, and testing its efficacy as infrastructure. Developing the Living Breakwaters project only because, and this goes back to the image of Little Island, the policy and the regulations inform everything that we do. So if it were not for Secretary Sean Donovan rewriting and spending probably 6 months rewriting a small code in the Sandy Recovery Act, rebuild by design, resilient by design, none of these things would have even happened. So we have to kind of work upstream and get into this policy context. Testing it, building it, funding it, seeding it with oysters, working with community groups, developing relationships with schools, developing finfish habitat, and now seeing it through toward construction. But all of that is also one incredibly modest project, federally funded, and that took 8 years as a fast-tracked funding project. So I'm very dismayed that Heather, who is my friend, is not here to talk, because we share this desire to essentially work upstream in a policy environment to enable all of us to be able to do the projects that we want to do and to work at the scale that we need to be working at. For now, people are the scalar factor. That's behavior change. That's not just looking in awe at a landscape in the distance. That's working, that's behavior change, that's modification. What else do we need to do? We need to connect, and we need to connect more radically and not in cars. So this is a project on the boards for SCAPE. This is a Chattahoochee Riverlands project in which we are designing a 100 linear mile trail. You can see it here in yellow. There's Florida. And it's incredibly mind-boggling effort to bring blueways, greenways, and non-motorized transportation at the scale of the region. Let's connect in radical ways. Let's move past these smaller scale projects. It's incredibly difficult. But to really address climate, we need these massively expansive and connective landscapes. Let's depave. Hear ya, Martha. Because one challenge here is that the way that we've planned for water today is a matter of life and death for the world. So these are a series of studios that I've done at Columbia over the past 7 years, looking at water and climate in global cities. I have visited each one of these cities, spent much time there, and all I can say is that the mistakes that, in many cases, that we have made, likely in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s here in the United States, are largely being replicated around the globe. And I could say 10 examples of each one of these cities in which, rather than depaving, or rather than thinking about 15-minute cities, water bodies are actively being canalized, et cetera. So unfortunately, our practices in the United States are being promulgated wildly. And there's my good friend and colleague Dilip with the race to the dam, the Himalayas, et cetera. Here we are with students in Pune. This river is now canalized. Here we are in Can Tha, Vietnam. This is one of the last living rivers. In Can Tha, Vietnam, a city about to encircle itself by a 14-foot flood wall in Vietnam, funded by the World Bank. So these are very, very difficult challenges. We actually don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. There is managed retreat. There's ecological injustice. There are large-scale, cross-border, global challenges. This is a map of dams on the Upper Mekong that have a profound impact below. So these challenges and the ecocide that we're facing go beyond, so far beyond. So what do? We have to keep working. We have to keep delivering projects that are excellent, but we can also jackhammer, depave, and protest. And here's, while we were in Vietnam, we learned more about the water dropping, the changing chemistry, and there's also around in different countries that are impacted by these dams, some serious protests, because this means literally life and livelihood for the poorest of the poor. So these landscapes that are slightly outside our purview, they're not our landscapes because we haven't designed them, but they have impacted, they will impact us tremendously. Ban, a big one slide, cars all but banned on one of Manhattan's busiest streets. We can absolutely do it. Rip out. And now here's where, it gets to be a little bit more difficult, because what does it mean? I think the idea of, ripping out or dealing with our transportation, our car-based infrastructure, the dams that we have built in the last century, is probably one of the most profound and creative acts that we could do in the next coming decades, but it will not be something that is easy. It is not something that is written into our policy and is not something that anyone ever will agree to, but we need to do it. And so finally, I'm closing with this image of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where as part of my center at Columbia, we held a couple of workshops. And, all I would say is we're stuck. We are as stuck as this river here, which is confined by two edges. Johnstown is stuck economically. We have a lot to deal with, and I'm hoping that my colleague, Billy Fleming, who I hope is here, is going to speak about the Green New Deal Super Studio this afternoon in his remarks. But we do need a larger scale national policy that interweaves design, justice, decarbonization at our fingertips. And I'm so grateful to everybody who participated in the Green New Deal Super Studio. So I'll close there with just a heartening word that ecocide and the loss of the Earth's biodiversity in all its immense texture, color, scale, and intensity is an aesthetic and moral question that dwarfs our more internal conversations about architecture and landscape. So unmaking the errors of the past and recognizing each other and the Earth as worthy of deep care is one of the most profound challenges before us. So a positive note to close on, love. This is pulled this one out of the basement. This is my thesis from University of Virginia, Beth, at 1993, called Ecofeminism. And I looked at it, and it's like, okay, so all of the, at least in my head, with all of these kind of notions about socio-ecological change are kind of all prefiguring here and all prefigured here. I'm so excited to be part of this event, Courageous by Design. I think literally feminism, social justice have so much to bring to this discussion and to how we practice. And this recent book, All We Can Save, I contributed a chapter to it, I think sort of tries to consolidate and describe my thoughts on the matter now and how we can try to scale up working together, because I mentioned the project unit alone is wholly insufficient, but many projects coordinated and working together can agglomerate and make big transformative change, and I think that's where we need to go. So I'll close with this by Adrian, very apt poem for, I think, honoring the TCLF in this event. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. So let's go off and reconstitute the world. Thank you.